listening to the Recovering Methodism Podcast, a global Methodist voice for navigating life and ministry in the 21st century, tackling the issues impacting the church, and recovering the distinctly Methodist practices to participate in the next Great Awakening. And now your hosts, David Cady and Caleb Spiker.
All right, well, we are back. Recovering Methodism Podcast.
Another episode. Looking forward to having some conversation today around spiritual formation and how the local church is onboarding new members and just that process of what it looks like, especially from a global Methodist perspective of how we help folks engage in the kind of discipleship that leads to life transformation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so we were at the Allegheny West Annual Conference here a couple weekends ago, and there was a pretty interesting bit of research that George Barna actually did about 15 years ago that was presented to us there by Kevin Watson. I don't know if you were in that particular session or not, but he was talking about the 10 stops in the Christian journey.
I was not in that session. I attended the other ones. By the way, there was some wonderful teaching going on at that annual conference.
Indeed,
and a lot of just information and ideas that were being shared that I think are very practical in the life of the local church. And this is one of them.
Yeah. So George Barna, back in 2009, 10, 11, he did some research amongst Christians. And was trying to map out the 10 stops in the journey of transformation, beginning at the place where you have no understanding of, your sin or, sin more generally, and
which describes someone that traditionally we'd say is lost. Gotcha.
Yeah. And then that second stop where you begin to notice that something's wrong.
Right.
You might not quite understand what, but like something is broken in the world. And then stop 3, that's something that's wrong. I'm a part of it.
It's me. Yeah, I'm the problem.
I'm the problem. And then, from there, getting to this place where you repent, where you make some sort of response and faith to God's grace and experience new life.
So part of that understanding is not only am I the problem, I'm not the solution.
Exactly right.
That Jesus is the solution. And so there's this awakening, the spiritual awakening that occurs that leads to faith and repentance.
Indeed. Yep. And then Barna talks about the 5th stop tends to be the place that the American church has tried to keep people because it's very marketable.
So this concept that you're going to be talking about is often embraced by, we'll say, big evangelical movements of keeping people busy and occupied.
Yep.
And they're good activities, right? But they don't always necessarily lead to life transformation.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, Barna calls it consumer formation.
Consumer formation. Okay.
So it has sort of the general look of the spiritually formative Christian disciplines, but it's continually changing. It's novel. It is making sure as best as you can that people don't get to the place where I'm just not being fed anymore.
So let's just get real practical here. This would be a series and cycle of Bible studies or activities.
8-week Bible study, followed by a short-term mission trip, followed by being in the choir, followed by the quilting club, right? Like any sort of program that you can continue to move from one thing to the next.
But yet that's my life, right? That's our experience in the local church, and they're not bad things.
No, of course not.
But they don't always produce life change. Is that what you're saying?
And they, if we get in the spin cycle of going from thing to thing to thing, they won't produce maturity.
So the tendency then is in local church is to try to keep the plate spinning with all these activities. Otherwise, people get to the place where I'm not being fed and we're not doing anything, and so on and so forth.
And this is stop 6, a prolonged period of spiritual discontent.
Say that again.
So stop 6 is a prolonged period of spiritual discontent.
Okay.
And that is a necessary place in the Christian journey where you learn how to bring your actual life under the lordship of Jesus, where you can get onto the road toward entire sanctification.
So are you suggesting that a person can be involved in all kinds of church activity, Bible study, mission trips, service projects, activities within the local church, and not find life change?
I am more than just suggesting it. I'm saying you and I have been in this industry long enough to say that's the norm.
Sure. And so what the necessary step is, step 6, this spiritual dissatisfaction, one could see that and say, well, that's a bad thing, when really it's a good thing.
It is in the same way that with I remember, so we have 3 little boys, and with each of them, we had that time in their life where we had to put them in their bedroom and shut the door, and they would wail, "Why don't you love me? Why aren't you here with me?"
Bedtime.
Gotcha. But a parent who cares about their child knows they need to figure out how to trust that their parents are there even when they can't see them.
Right.
And fall asleep even if their parents aren't right there with them.
So just real quick here, we're not saying that Bible study, that activity in the ministries of a local church, that mission trips are bad things.
Of course not.
We're saying that they don't always produce the long-lasting life change results that we think they're going to produce.
Yes, outside of actually doing that hard work of walking through the, what St. John the Cross would call the dark night of the soul, that sense of, I don't feel all the warm fuzzies about being a Christian that I once did, but I'm going to choose to remain in a disciplined life. I'm going to choose to become even more introspective and see if there are parts of my life that I haven't submitted to the lordship of Jesus.
So I'm thinking back, there'd be a lot of folks listening perhaps went through Disciple Bible Study in the 90s, which back then was about a 36-week course, right? Mm-hmm. And many people experienced tremendous life change in that. Many people experienced call to ministry through that. And many people point to that experience as significant in their faith journey, perhaps because it wasn't an 8-week course, that it was intended to be almost an entire year's worth of in-depth Bible study and community that perhaps gave space for God to work and act in specific ways. But what I sense from Barna's research, and maybe what Kevin Watson was presenting, is this concept in the local church of keeping people occupied, the next Bible study with the next activity, programmatic year activities, is not something that necessarily provides enough time and space and depth for people to actually engage in what God is doing in their life. And it maybe pacifies the congregation to say, we're doing good things, but it's not producing the kind of change, and it doesn't lead to that spiritual dissatisfaction. Is that on target?
I think so. Yeah, and I think Barna would take it a step further to say that spin cycle of activity doesn't lead us to the place of dying to self.
And dying to self is necessary for the lordship of Jesus to be a reality in our lives.
Exactly right.
Because if I don't die to self,
we can't inherit new life.
There you go. Now, for those who may be listening who are perhaps pastoring churches that maybe don't have a lot of resources or staff or activity going on, there may be a tendency to say, well, we need to do an 8-week Bible study, and that gives us something to do, and our folks will have something to do. And what we're perhaps listening to Barna or Kevin Watson will say, wait a second, you don't have to imitate the plate spinning activities of a larger church. You don't have to get in and develop the spin cycle of activity. There may be a different way.
Well, and we're about to, in a later segment, talk about our 8-week new member program, that if it stops at the end of 8 weeks, then it has failed its purpose, right? Like I think those short programs have a lot of value for resourcing people to live into the next season of life.
Okay.
But if it ends at the end of 8 weeks, then we're just feeding the consumer machine.
If it ends after 8 weeks, and I'll add, or establishes a pattern of spin cycle for the next 8 weeks of activity.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is we're trying to demonstrate the kind of Christian community that is ongoing and goes deeper.
Precisely.
That allows for individuals to come to places of growth in their faith where dying to self is an ongoing and daily practice, and surrendering to the Lordship of Jesus is not a one-time activity.
Yeah. So for Barna, from that place of spiritual discontent, there's the stop of heightened awareness of sin. That just because we repented there on March 10th, 1995, and asked Jesus to be our Savior, that isn't the end of our repentant process. Because, as Kevin Watson points out in the class meeting, Christian maturity is the daily task of giving all that we know of ourselves to all that we know of God.
That's fantastic. So I just signed up myself and my 3 kids for the Powell Turkey Trot on Thanksgiving morning. And I have this image of crossing the starting line and saying, hey, I'm done. Mm-hmm. Right? And so you're pointing back to maybe a beginning point in a person's faith journey, we use in March of 1995 or whatever it may be for an individual, and realizing that, hey, I just got started. There's a whole race to run of the faith journey. And what you're suggesting from Barna's research and from what Kevin presented at the annual conference is that we have to help folks learn to run the race set before them by creating the kind of Christian community that allows for deeper growth in this faith journey, this heightened awareness of sin. Is that accurate?
Because with a heightened awareness of sin, we can make the decision to die to self and receive God's grace. And like we talked about in our Bible study this morning where we were looking at the Beatitudes, it's in that place of spiritual bankruptcy that we are filled.
Right.
That we're filled with a love for God and a love for our neighbor that, as Wesley would say, we're entirely sanctified. Even if for just a moment. Because, the wisdom of Watson brings us back to, 2 weeks from now, you'll be different. Are you willing to bring that new self under the Lordship of Christ?
And just as it would be foolish to enter a 4-mile race and cross the starting line and think that you're finished, right? Mm-hmm. It would be foolish to say, I had an experience with God and I gave my life to Jesus, therefore I'm all good, I'm in. Mm-hmm. That would be foolish, right? There's an entire race to run in which we need to continue to die to self and surrender the Lordship of Jesus. And as I heard you say the other night at another worship service, if you don't continually surrender the Lordship of Jesus and become more like Jesus in your daily life, you have a tendency to become more like Caleb in your daily life, which...
It's a problem.
That's a problem in all of our lives. The more... Nobody needs Dave on the throne.
No.
No, we need Jesus on the throne, right? Indeed. And so as I become more under the Lordship of Jesus, that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. But it has to be an ongoing thing.
Indeed.
Okay. And so how does Barna finish up this 10-step description of the Christian life? Now, he's not Wesleyan necessarily.
Nope.
And so you added some language, right, entire sanctification, that maybe Barna doesn't go to.
No.
All right, so unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah. So for Barna, you get through the spin cycle. You have the prolonged period of spiritual discontent, that dark night of the soul, leads to heightened awareness of sin, leads to death to self, and then once you've died to self, you can find yourself with a deep and abiding love for God, and then a deep and abiding love for your neighbor. Which, we as Wesleyans call entire sanctification. Now, Barna, being a little more reformed in nature, doesn't want to see people backslide back to 6 and 7 and 8. But as Wesleyans, we say like that's just the ebb and flow of life as a human, right? That we will have these times where we truly have given all that we know of ourselves to all that we know of God. But a week from now, we'll learn something new about ourselves, or something that had been defeated a month ago is going to rear its ugly head, and we have to, kill it again. And that's, I think that's where we put that focus on, are we going to focus on spin cycle formation or on deep Christian formation? Because a lot of those things that we introduce in Stop 5 are going to be the sort of things that help you keep your life under the lordship of Jesus. But it's that are we keeping people busy, or are we helping people mature? I think that's a question that every church has to ask.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
because it's really painful to let people go to stop 6. That tends to be when they say, I'm not getting fed, I need to go find another church, or even worse, I'm not feeling it anymore. I'm not sure if Christianity is actually for me. But if we are helping folks to be seaworthy ships and not paper boats, mm-hmm. That's a journey we need to be willing to make with them.
So in the later segments of this podcast, we're going to talk about a book, part of Caleb's library, that talks about sticky faith and allowing particularly young people to engage in the spiritual formation mm-hmm. of their lives at a young age and living that out for the rest of their lives. And in the Pastor's Toolbox, we're going to talk about onboarding new members and establishing a pattern for what it means to be a part of a local church in our context, in a global Methodist context, which, again, what we're pointing to here is the class meeting, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And band meetings as a way of ongoing spiritual formation, not consumer formation, but ongoing processes and practices of what we'll say Wesleyan Methodism, which we're trying to rediscover and recover, right?
Yeah, indeed.
And so anything else you want to say regarding what Watson's taught at the Allegheny West Annual Conference, or your understanding of Barna's research that you want to add to our conversation today?
I think the thing I'd come back to is Watson, much like our podcast from a couple weeks ago talking about Alistair Begg's book Brave, talks about how in this Christian negative culture, where there isn't social benefit to being part of a church, that without deep spiritual formation, you won't survive. Because everything culturally is blowing you in the opposite direction. And I think that's kind of a sobering word for us. Especially as a parent thinking about how to invite my kids to trust Jesus with every part of their lives. It's like it is not the sort of thing that the natural flow of the culture we're in is going to push them into the life of a local church. Which is why we need to be more intentional than ever about, being wholly present in abiding in Jesus and using these spiritual disciplines to create space for God to work in us.
Yeah, that's good stuff. That's good. So we're going to transition here to some other segments, and we're going to talk more practical ways of how to do that with say a youth group or a children's ministry, and how we do that with new members joining the local church. So I think this is a good conversation, and I think it perhaps will give us some opportunity for future podcasts to maybe unpack this in some different ways. So thank you for sharing about Barna's research. Thank you for sharing about what Kevin Watson presented. And for those who are out there in local churches who are perhaps trying to figure out how to lead ministry in a context where you don't have a lot of resources or staff, understand this. You don't have to imitate larger congregations that have a lot of activity, what you need to do is focus on ways that are culturally appropriate to your context to allow folks to grow in a way through this recovering Methodist process of class meetings, and allowing folks to grow deeper in their process, not in just little segments of consumer formation, but deep spiritual formation that's ongoing.
That's right.
And now it's time for Caleb's Library.
Caleb, we're back to our one of my favorite parts of our podcast, which is Caleb's Library, and it gives us a chance to talk about one of the books you've been reading. And so today you've got for us a book. How long ago did you read this book, by the way?
First time 8 or 9 years ago.
You said first time.
Yeah.
You read books more than once?
If they're good.
All right. It's 8 or 9 years ago. This is Sticky Faith by Powell and Clark.
Yep.
All right. So
they're at the Fuller Youth Institute out in California.
Okay.
And it's a book all about helping to create an environment where your kids can grow up to follow Jesus.
That seems important.
It's really my most important job in this world.
You got it.
So
it sounds like, just by the title of the book, this is allowing faith to stick, right? So that kids don't go through a program of youth ministry or children's ministry and come out the other end and are no longer Christian.
Yeah. So at the Fuller Youth Institute, they were doing a bunch of research around the kids who went off to school and they were never heard from again. And the kids who went off to school and got engaged with campus ministry and came back, and everywhere in the middle. And this book is largely based on those findings. Yeah. Tells some stories anecdotally. Gives some data. Their big sort of overarching message is if you, as a parent, want your kid to grow up and follow Jesus, it's not going to happen accidentally.
Okay. Well, let's start there then.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why this book is so important to you. You're father of 3 kids.
Yeah.
Right? You grew up in the church and kind of went through the children youth ministry program in your church.
Yep.
Went away to college and came back, and you found out most of the people in your youth group were no longer in church, right? So that was your personal experience.
And I didn't just go to any youth group. I went to the youth group, right? Like there were youth pastors from all the surrounding counties who would come and see what we were doing, because there at the church in Marysville growing up, like it was the premier youth program.
Okay.
By the time we were 30, there were a bunch of folks who we just didn't see anymore.
Okay.
But even just anecdotally for me, I was sitting down with my friend Kathy, who also grew up in that church, and the things that we found were consistent about all of us. One, our parents were active in Emmaus.
Okay.
So they had some sort of disciplined spiritual life that was lived out in community. And 2, they were involved in missions at some point in our time growing up. They were a chaperone on one of the youth mission trips. They'd go on their own mission trip. Like those 2 things seem to be the only thing that really, was true of those of us who stuck around.
So without even going into mission trips and Emmaus experience, just 30,000-foot view, parents who were involved in their Christian journey and in the life of the church beyond just 2.3 Sundays per month.
Yeah.
Right? That took their faith seriously, oftentimes have young people in their lives that have an ongoing relationship with Jesus when they become adults.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. So I don't think Sticky Faith is going to go into those kind of details about Emmaus but tell us a little bit about the book and what this book is suggesting to us as far as diagnosing the problem and how local churches and how parents can try to help their young people live out their Christian life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first takeaway is like, don't expect the professionals to be able to pull it off, right? Like, delegating the discipling of your children to paid professionals in the church is a mistake. Because at the end of the day, parents have a lot more influence than youth pastors.
This is for sure.
I mean, just from a time standpoint, we're talking about, the average youth group kid may have 70-ish contact hours with the youth pastor in a given year. And they have more than 3,000 with you as a parent. Yep. Even if the kid's going to school, involved in sports and other extracurriculars, as the parent, you are still spending the most time with your kid. And you can be intentional about, both how that time is spent with your kid, and then also forming other adult relationships around them.
Yes.
So that, their formation isn't just from you, but it's from, a group of people who are working together to help your kid, discover who they are in Christ. So in chapter 5, they talk about flipping the 5-to-1 principle. So in youth ministry, they say, you shouldn't have more than 5 kids for every 1 adult. Or like that's kind of the that had been, at least at the time of this book being written, that had been kind of the wisdom, right? It's like, have an adult for every 5 kids.
Makes sense.
But what Powell and Clark suggests is that no, you need to have 5 caring adults in the life of every kid.
Oh, wow.
And, historically, this is done mostly by family members.
Sure. Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa.
An uncle or two,
right.
Aunt or two, maybe a neighbor. But in, this increasingly transient society, it requires a little more effort.
It does.
It requires, as a Christian parent, with my Christian spouse, engaging in intentional relationships with other Christian adults, sure. And inviting them into our lives and being a part of theirs.
So if I say it a different way, in this day and age, in the culture and context in which we live, you have to be a little more intentional to create a home field advantage.
Yeah.
Right. So you're going to have to be intentional about.
You have to send Connor Stallions into that opposing stadium, view the hand signals of the enemy, and make sure that you are audibling to a.
For those who are listening and don't get that reference, that is a University of Michigan reference about stealing signals. So you have to Google that and figure out what's going on there. But I got it. I got where you were going. That's good. I like that. So I have to believe there are folks out there that are pastoring churches that may not have a lot of resources.
Yeah.
Don't have any staff, and any suggestions of how they can make a culture in their church that is intentional about reaching another generation for Christ.
Well, I would almost make the argument that there is an advantage to being a small church when it comes to
I agree.
Developing sticky faith, because you don't have the resources to hire the professional to fix your kid.
I agree.
You naturally have to be a little more intentional. Like if you're going to have a youth program at all, chances are it's going to be volunteers who think it up, make it happen, get the other adult leaders to work together. So I would almost say the bigger question is for the big church with a big budget and youth staffing, how do you do it? Because I think there's And I think that my own experience in churches of different sizes would bear this out to be true. That in the smaller church, they get it a little more naturally.
It's culture.
Yeah.
Right. And in a larger church that, historically has had a staff person, the culture is, well, that's their job.
Yep.
Right. As opposed to into a church that doesn't have those resources. Mm-hmm. It's our job. Right.
That's right.
And so part of it is leveraging that, we'll say, organic culture within a church. I know in my experience, we didn't have a paid youth person, right? It was parents that led the youth ministry. But beyond that, there were other people in the congregation that would, I'll say, take me under their wing, that whether I knew what was going on or not, they were building relationship with me. I remember Al Shipley, and he was the head usher. And one Sunday, I was probably 13, 14, 15 years old. He said, would you be interested in helping me take up the offering every Sunday? I'm like, well, I don't know what to do. He said, just follow me.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be like Al, right? So he took me under his wing and got me involved in leadership in the church at that basic level. But it also, I had something to do.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was not a struggle to get me out of bed to go to church because Al was counting on me. Yeah. Right? And so that's part of it, I think. Whether Al had read Al didn't read Sticky Faith. That was a long time ago, right? But he got the concept, right? And so I think that's where you're going with this. A smaller congregation culturally has natural resources that can be leveraged to help a younger generation find a church home and grow.
Yeah, and one of the things they talk about is desegregating the church. I think we are on the back end of this ecclesial experiment where we, separate everyone by age group and try to give an age appropriate, offering for everyone. The difficulty is that you have folks who go off to college who've never been in church, and then they come and they're like,
what we're doing? What is this? Yeah, what is this?
Like,
right.
When do we play, fluffy bunnies, right? Like,
right.
Where are the games? Like, why are we?
I understand.
So I think part of what they push for as well is earlier integration of kids into the life of the total church.
Sure.
Rather than, continuing to, this isn't their word, this is my word, coddle, the different age groups and, try to zero in on whatever, to instead invite them into a more adult expression of faith earlier.
Okay. Well, that's a struggle that many churches are facing, right?
Yeah.
Because that's been kind of the trendy thing to do for a long time.
I mean, for 30 years, we've been trying to have something age appropriate for everybody.
That's accurate, right? And I think there are times when that's appropriate, but not consistently.
Yeah.
Right? So you could have an entire generation of young people who've never experienced big church, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's reality.
Well, and even as a young parent, the assumption when, we are engaging in accountable discipleship is to get other young parents, like get together a bunch of people who are all in the same stage of life.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake. You really need to have those grizzled veterans of, raising children who are there with you in the midst of it. And
grizzled veterans.
Yes.
Do I qualify?
Yes.
Getting close, huh? Yeah, well, that's true. That's probably right.
You've seen your 3 kids through a bunch of stages that we haven't even entered into yet.
Yeah, you have no idea. Well, you don't have girls, so that's different.
Oh, boy.
But you got 3 boys. Big deal. So on Sticky Faith, do they talk about age-appropriate ministry, or do they address that? Or do they suggest kind of what I'll call cross-pollinating relationships in the life of a congregation so that there's a depth and a breadth to a young person's relationship in a local church?
Yeah, they will always take the opportunity to push intergenerational ministry.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, and they'll they acknowledge that there are certain things you don't want to talk about in front of grandma, and grandma doesn't want you talking about them in front of her.
Sure.
But that any opportunity you can to be intergenerational in your ministry, they would say is something to try to make happen.
All right. So you've read this a number of times, obviously, so it's an important book to you. Again, it's Sticky Faith by Powell and Clark.
Yep.
And anything else you want to give us on this book?
I don't think so. It is one of those books that when you read it with a 3-year-old, it reads a certain way, and when you read it with a 9-year-old, it reads a different way.
Okay.
So it's one of those that you can come back to, and as you hit the different stages of life, new insights become more important.
All right.
So read it and come back in 3 years and read it again.
Okay. All right. Sticky Faith. Recommend it.
Recommend it.
All right. Thanks for this edition of Caleb's Library.
Now for some practical wisdom for church leaders. Let's open up the pastor's toolbox.
So Dave, here as we open up the toolbox today, we're going to talk a little bit about how we bring new members into the church, how we initiate people into the community of faith. Thoughts?
Well, there's all kinds of ways to do that, obviously.
It's true.
And one of the things I'd like to be able to say to those who are listening is if you're a pastor of a church and you have some things you want to say about some of these issues that we raised during the toolbox, we'd love to hear from you. What's the email address?
recoveringmethodism@gmail.com.
recoveringmethodism@gmail.com. If you have some thoughts and insights on how you do new member onboarding, initiation, catechesis, we'd love to hear from you on that. But obviously, people do it differently.
Yep.
Okay. And so in some situations, there's a very specific process in which those who are interested in joining the church go through, whether it's 3 weeks, 4 weeks, in our case, 8 weeks of classes. It's obviously it's important to hear the content, but it's also about building relationships and having the fellowship of people that are joining the church come together, but also allowing folks who are already part of the church to connect with them as well.
That's right.
In other situations, it's a little less structured, okay? And I think that maybe for some folks, there needs to be a hybrid. I don't know. I'll let people decide that on their own. But right now, what we're doing is we have an 8-week class called Foundations, and it's a pretty good curriculum. Tell us a little bit about Foundations, maybe, and help folks understand what we're doing here at Riverside Church in Columbus to help folks on board here at Riverside.
Yeah, and you talked about it, like there's a really wide spectrum within the history of the church as to how people came to be initiated into the church. There's stories from the early church where it's a multi-year process of catechesis.
Sure.
Before you get to be baptized on Easter Sunday and come in. And then, we have friends, especially down south, where someone the first Sunday they can come, go up to the altar and become a member.
Yeah. Little less structured.
So for us, as we were talking about new member stuff, we were talking about how do you give people an experience of the life of the church in a condensed window.
Right.
So, as Global Methodists, we are deeply committed to the idea of watching over one another in love. The class meeting-ish type structure, which, for our toolbox, one of these days we'll get to Watson's class meeting, I'm sure. But so we have this deep commitment to watching over one another in love, having accountable discipleship in a group format. But we also have these more educational pieces that for someone who's going to join a global Methodist church, they should understand what they're coming to be a part of.
Absolutely. It's interesting. We're seeing a lot of folks come to Riverside right now from other United Methodist congregations because we're kind of on an island here in Columbus. And they'll often say, I've been a Methodist all my life. Do I need to go to a class to join? Can I just transfer my membership? And part of the answer is we'd love to have you here. We're glad you're here. We can transfer your membership, but we really want you to be part of this class because this is a new thing, right? We're in a new denomination, and part of that is learning what that is, right?
Yeah.
What's the doctrine? How is it different? Because we're not UMC 2.0. We're very different.
Yep.
But also, what is it? How do you understand the culture of this local congregation?
Yeah.
And how do you build those relationships with other people? And so it's kind of multi-layered process where there's doctrine, there's disciplines, there's the catechesis, but also there's the fellowship and the culture of the local church. And I see that unfolding in the foundations class that you're leading. By the way, Caleb's leading that in somebody's home, right? And so someone has opened up their home. It's not done here at the local church. It's done in somebody's home, which again models
hospitality, warmth,
and class meeting, right? So if the class meeting process is going to be inherent in what we do, it's part of our DNA, then it's being modeled as a part of the initiation process, right? I mean, that's what it's designed to do.
Yeah. So when we were putting it together, we said, how do we give people an experience of accountable discipleship, of the class meeting, of watching over one another in love? Right. And then what are the pieces that need to be present in order for that to be maximally effective? And, our experience as pastors and small group leaders and people who've helped people grow in their discipleship to Jesus, I think we both had this conviction that those groups of accountability, they really function best when there are specific disciplines to orient your life together in that process of wanting to become more like Jesus. So for us in Foundations, we have a week where we are talking about the basics of Orthodox Christianity, so talking about the creeds, talking about the history of the early church especially, and then we have a session where we're talking about Methodist doctrinal distinctives.
Right.
But then we get into the what Wesley called the ordinances of God, right? The spiritual disciplines,
means of grace,
the means of grace. So we'll do a week where we teach on prayer as a discipline, and then you have a week to experiment with it. And then the following week we come back and say, how did God meet you this week in your practice of prayer?
In your prayer time, where did you experience God?
We have a week on scripture reading, and then it's that same process. We have some opportunities throughout the week to study scripture in possibly new ways, and then say, how did God meet you in your scripture study?
Sure.
Worship, Sabbath, denial, generosity,
fasting. Yeah, right. Gotcha.
Confession. These disciplines that are at the foundation and the bedrock for Christianity as a whole, because we need to remember John Wesley was trying to rediscover primitive Christianity. And then for us as those who inherit that mantle, for us too, they're distinctives of Methodism as they're distinctives of Christianity more broadly.
So one of the things we talked about in a previous podcast was that these means of grace create space for God to work and move and act in our lives, speak into our lives. And so one of the things I like about what's happening in the Foundations class is that the individuals participating have an opportunity to write a spiritual autobiography. Okay? And so part of that, of course, is looking backward and saying, okay, how have I been shaped and formed, and what were some of the most influential experiences spiritually for my life? How did I come to Christ? How have I been shaped, and what brought me to this place? But I would think also it's overlapped with what's happening now, right? And these practices of prayer and scripture and worship and sacrament, and how they're reflecting on how God is acting, moving, and speaking in their life now, which I think produces in the long run a better capacity for someone to share their faith story.
Oh, undoubtedly.
And to evangelize and to witness and be, because most people who've not gone through a process like this are reluctant to share their faith journey or their faith story because they've never done it. They've been asked to do it.
Yeah.
And so this is a bit of I'll say a trial run for these individuals to learn to articulate their faith journey in a way and share it in a safe space and be better equipped in the future to be able to share their faith with others.
Yeah, and I think part of the resourcing of developing this more disciplined lifestyle is that when you have the opportunity to share your faith, it's not just what God did for me way back then, that I remember a little bit foggily.
Sure.
But it's, here's what's happened in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
Here's how God is continuing to speak into my life. Here's how, the Spirit continues to enliven what's going on. Here's how God continues to bring restoration to relationships, bring, the sanctification to the way I see my family, my neighbors and coworkers and so forth. So, I mean, like that's for us kind of that middle ground that we fell on. And I think it's, we are experimenting with it here, and I'm sure as time goes on, we'll tweak it here and there, and try to make it as maximally beneficial as we can. But I do think when we are talking about how we initiate people into the body, being clear about who you are and why you're doing things is important.
So my experience in ministry, yours as well probably, is there's the ideal and then there's the practical, and sometimes there's a big gap between the two of those things, right? And so right now we're kind of focused on the ideal, that if you want to join, you go through this 8-week class. But what we've already begun to experience is there are some who say, well, I can't make that particular class, but I still want to join. And we don't want to dissuade them from joining the church. At the same time, we don't want to ignore the fact that there are, let's say a dozen other people that are actually going through the process. And we don't want to have two tracks to membership, one where people go through the process and the others that don't. And so one of the things we'll have to figure out is how we're flexible and providing multiple opportunities for folks to experience this process. Right now, it's sort of our beta test, if you will. And so hopefully in the future, we'll be able to run multiple tracks of these kind of things. I don't know that we'll ever get to a place, or we should ever get to a place where it's a fast track.
I pray that we don't.
Because that defeats the purpose, right?
Well, and I think, part of what makes Christianity so special is it's the only organization in the world that there's no benefit to membership.
It's true.
I mean, yesterday we had a family that's a part of our church but has never become members, who we prayed for as they moved on to living in a different country.
Right.
Right? Like, we didn't say, well, you have to be members for us to, pray over you. Last night, I had a lady who is really, she's done with her United Methodist Church. She said, like, what will happen if I just cancel my membership over there? I said, nothing. Because in the Christian church, like, this is the only organization in the world that there's no benefit to membership. And, I think there probably was at some point a sort of cultural expectation to be able to say, well, yeah, I'm a member here or whatever. But increasingly, I think when we are talking about membership, we are talking about a commitment to a community and to a style of life that's going to look weird.
Radically different.
In our wider culture.
Radically different, right, than the culture.
Yeah.
It does look weird.
So it's like, if a Christian, 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 if a Chris a 8-week commitment makes you say, "Oh, that's not for me." Well, then you're probably right. We aren't trying to launch 1,000 paper boats here, right? We're trying to build seaworthy ships,
right?
And from a truth-telling standpoint, and from a caring for the spiritual health of someone's standpoint, to say, well, we are affirming the shape of your religious life without any sort of actual relationship being built is a mistake.
There is no discipleship without relationship.
That's right.
And it has to be modeled.
There's no holiness other than social holiness.
I've heard that somewhere before.
Yeah.
Well, this is how we're currently doing it at Riverside. Mm-hmm. Again, we'd love to hear from other pastors and other churches about how they're doing it. And if you want more information about foundations and what we're doing here at Riverside, just email us at recoveringmethodism@gmail.com. And love to hear from you. But this, I think it's a good conversation for our toolbox today about how we're currently onboarding people and providing a process for folks to connect to this local church and make it their spiritual home.
Yep.
All right. Well, I appreciate this opportunity to talk about it. And we're going to close the lid on the toolbox and open shut. And we'll pick up something next time. Thanks, Caleb.
Sounds good, Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Recovering Methodism podcast. We hope your heart has been strangely warmed. Be sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a 5-star review. God bless.